My brother locked me in the freezer. My dad laughed, calling it a prank. But when I sued for $8 million, they begged. That night, at the annual Vance Thanksgiving Gala in our sprawling Chicago home, Michael thought he was being funny. The air was thick with the scent of sage stuffing and old money, and I, Eleanor Ellie Vance, was standing by the industrial-grade walk-in freezer off the kitchen, discussing compliance regulations with my fiancé, Ethan Hayes. Michael, my 30-year-old brother and the golden child, had been drinking heavily and, fueled by the usual cocktail of entitlement and resentment towards my success, he decided to perform his grand finale of the evening. As I reached for a bottle of sparkling water, he shoved me hard into the cold metal interior, and before I could even pivot, the heavy door slammed shut. The darkness was immediate, absolute, and the temperature instantly assaulted my skin. I heard the solid thunk of the latch, a heavy, metallic sound that signaled my imprisonment. I pounded on the door not in panic but in controlled, icy fury. "Michael, open this door right now!" I called out, my voice muffled by the thick paneling. I could hear faint, echoing laughter from the adjacent kitchen, a sound that always made my blood run cold. It was the sound of my father, James Vance. Michael's voice, slurred and self-satisfied, drifted through the metal. "Just cool off, Ellie. You know, a little chill time for the corporate ice queen. It's just a prank." Then came my father's signature booming guffaw, full of warmth and approval, the very approval I had spent 3 decades of my life being denied. "That's my boy! You tell her, Michael. She needs to learn to take a joke." I stopped pounding. I didn't waste any more energy trying to reason with the unreasonable. That moment, standing alone in the pitch-black, Arctic silence, the raw injustice of being intentionally locked in a life-threatening enclosure by my brother while my own father openly sanctioned the cruelty, was the exact moment the last thread of filial loyalty snapped. I was 33 years old, a highly successful corporate attorney in Manhattan, engaged to a partner at one of the top law firms in the country, and yet, in their eyes, I was still the invisible daughter, the scapegoat they could abuse for sport. I felt the cold seeping into my cashmere dress, but the core of me was burning with a clarity I'd never known. They think this is a joke? Fine. Let's see who gets the last laugh. When the door finally swung open, it was Ethan, who had calmly followed the commotion and instantly understood the severity of the situation. I didn't rush out. I simply stepped out, brushing imaginary frost from my perfectly tailored sleeve. Michael and Dad, momentarily silenced by Ethan's intense glare, stood there looking smug. My mother, Sarah, was nervously smoothing her cocktail dress, avoiding eye contact. "Well, I guess the joke's over," Michael muttered, still grinning. My father just shrugged, taking a sip of his Napa Valley Cabernet. "See, Ellie? Nothing to worry about. Just family fun." I looked directly at James, my father. His face, usually a mask of corporate confidence, held only dismissive amusement. "Family fun," I repeated, my voice steady and dangerously low, stripped of any warmth. I reached into the interior pocket of my dress and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. I walked past Michael, whose self-satisfied smirk faltered as he watched my eyes, and placed the drive silently on the granite countertop beside my father's glass. "No, Dad," I said, looking him dead in the eye, the chill from the freezer still radiating from my body. "The joke starts now, and it's not for free." I leaned in just enough for him to hear my next words over the ambient party noise. "Tell Michael to enjoy the rest of his life, because effective immediately, he'll be spending it defending a multi-million-dollar lawsuit covering the cost of the entire Vance family legacy." My mother gasped, a tiny, useless sound, but my father merely scoffed. "Lawsuit? For what? A little chill? We'll bury you in legal fees, Eleanor. You know how this works." I allowed myself a faint, predatory smile, the kind that had closed multi-billion-dollar deals. "That's where you're wrong, James. I didn't file the suit. Ethan did. And you know what they say in corporate law. You never sue unless you're guaranteed to win. See you in court." I didn't wait for their reaction. I simply linked arms with Ethan and walked out of the house, leaving behind the stunned silence of the Vance family and the still warm smell of apple pie. That single cold moment changed everything, setting the stage for the $8 million reckoning that would force them to their knees. That moment in the dark, refrigerated silence was the culmination of 3 decades of calculated cruelty. It was a cold, hard summary of my existence within the Vance family. Growing up, our sprawling Chicago home felt less like a haven and more like a stage where Michael, my brother, played the beloved leading man, and I was perpetually cast as the understudy who never got to perform. Michael was the handsome, charming, yet utterly mediocre son destined to inherit the family's mid-sized logistics empire, Vance Holdings. I was the quietly brilliant daughter, the one who consistently topped her classes, excelled in debate, and was accepted into Yale Law. Michael's acceptance into a state school's business program was celebrated with a new BMW and a $50,000 allowance for his entrepreneurial ventures, which mostly involved failed crypto schemes. My law school acceptance received a brief, obligatory nod and a suggestion from my father that I should probably focus on finding a nice husband to take care of you. I paid for my education myself, working 3 jobs through undergrad in Boston and taking out loans for my JD in New Haven and New York. While Michael was tailgating at football games and blowing trust fund money, I was burning the midnight oil in a cramped apartment, learning the intricacies of corporate fraud and legal ethics. Skills I never intended to use against my own family, but skills that, as fate would have it, became my greatest weapon. My entire life had been a series of small, grinding sacrifices. I deferred a major promotion to help Dad restructure Vance Holdings after Michael nearly bankrupted a subsidiary. I listened patiently as my mother constantly bragged about Michael's imaginary achievements to her friends, and I swallowed the bitter pill every Christmas when Michael's gift was a vintage watch and mine was a gift card to Target. But the emotional abuse was what truly left scars. Michael, sensing my parents' tacit approval, was a master of the public insult. He'd spill the tea at family potlucks, revealing embarrassing personal details I'd confided in him, or constantly throw shade at my career, calling my work boring paperwork. The freezer incident, however, was a significant escalation from a joke to actionable malice. It was the moment I realized their cruelty wasn't passive. It was actively dangerous and deeply intentional. They didn't just neglect me, they enjoyed harming me. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I didn't wake up angry, I woke up surgical. I met Ethan at our usual power breakfast spot in Midtown Manhattan, a quiet, exclusive place where the deal was done, not the dishes. Ethan, always calm and sharp in his expensive suit, was already waiting. He'd witnessed the incident firsthand and, the ice in his eyes told me he was ready to back me all the way. He had seen the way they treated me, and as a powerful, hyper-focused corporate litigator, he saw them not as family, but as adversaries. "I need you to tell me exactly how deep this can go, Ethan," I said, skipping the small talk and getting right to the point. I didn't want reconciliation or a weak apology. I wanted consequences that matched their decades of neglect and that specific cruel act of endangerment. Ethan leaned back, folding his hands. "Ellie, legally, the freezer incident is open and shut battery and false imprisonment. Given the industrial nature of the freezer and your father's admitted recorded participation, we can argue for severe emotional distress, reckless endangerment, and a high punitive damage claim. The number we use for maximum leverage? $8 million. It's high enough to hurt their balance sheet and hit the national news, but defensible enough to scare their insurance company into settling. But if we want to truly break the cycle, we need to hit Vance Holdings itself." I nodded. That was the core issue. I had been conducting quiet due diligence on Vance Holdings for months, originally just out of professional curiosity. What I had discovered was the true betrayal. The one that made the $8 million lawsuit seem like just the opening salvo. A year prior, my father had asked me to review some complex trust documents related to the Vance family trust, which held 60% of Vance Holdings' equity. He had told me it was a routine update for tax purposes. Because I was a lawyer, and their lawyer, I had followed his instruction to review only the tax implications. I hadn't seen the actual list of beneficiaries. I know James has been funneling money out of the holding company and into Michael's personal accounts, disguised as consulting fees for his failed ventures, I stated, pulling up a decrypted file on my tablet. I found the missing $1.5 million last quarter. But that's nothing compared to the trust. That USB I gave James last night? It contained an anonymized summary of the original 1995 trust documents, the one they thought was safely locked away in the family safe. Ethan raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine admiration in his eyes. You went dark. What did you find? I found that the trust dictated a strict 50-50th split of the equity between Michael and me upon James's death, provided we both held C-level positions for 5 continuous years. Michael was given his C-level role, Chief Strategy Officer, a purely ceremonial title, 3 years ago. I was never offered one. More importantly, when James asked me to review the tax update, he was actually finalizing an amendment that, under a newly created loophole, would transfer all voting shares to Michael upon James's retirement next year, effectively excluding me from any meaningful ownership, even of my 50% equity. They thought their lawyer, old Mr. Henderson, had buried the original in a way I'd never find it. I had found it. Using my corporate forensics training, I had tracked an unusual document transfer in the firm's ancient cloud archives, and, with the help of a former law school colleague now working at a digital security firm, Linda Chen, my steadfast best friend, I'd recovered the original 1995 document and the crucial, newly inserted clause from the amendment that sealed my fate. It was a clear-cut case of financial discrimination and breach of fiduciary duty within the corporate structure, all designed to rob me of my birthright. So, they didn't just lock you in a freezer for a laugh, Ethan mused, tapping the table. They knew you were close to finding the financial exclusion and were preemptively throwing you out of the picture. The prank was a final show of contempt. They thought that by insulting you so publicly and deeply, they'd shame you into silence. Exactly, I affirmed. They thought I'd cry and retreat to New York. They expected me to be scared off by the physical and emotional intimidation, but they messed with the wrong daughter. The $8 million lawsuit for battery and emotional distress related to the freezer is just the media hook. The real play is the civil suit against Vance Holdings for shareholder oppression and the motion to freeze all assets related to the 1995 trust until the 2024 amendment is invalidated. We hit them where it hurts, their reputation and their wallet. We spent the next week, fueled by too many triple-shot lattes from Starbucks, meticulously building the case. Linda, my friend in digital security, recovered the kitchen security footage from Thanksgiving night. There was Michael shoving me in, and then the damning sequence. James watching, smiling, and giving Michael a proud high five after he locked the door. The audio, faint but clear, captured James's voice. "That's good work, son. That'll teach her to keep her nose out of the books." This footage was the linchpin for the emotional distress claim. Undeniable, visual proof of malicious intent and parental approval of battery. The initial legal documents, filed by Ethan's firm in the Northern District of Illinois, landed on James Vance's desk 2 days before Black Friday. The headline, Eleanor Vance sues family. Vance Holdings for $8 million after freezer assault. The press immediately latched on to the story. The corporate ice queen's chilly revenge. The phone calls started immediately. My mother, Sarah, called first. Her voice a fragile blend of panic and false cheer. "Ellie, darling, please, can we talk? This is so embarrassing. Your father is livid. It was just a joke. Michael's having an emotional reaction. We'll take him out for a new SUV. Just please, call off the lawyers." "It's not a joke, Mom," I said, looking out at the cold New York skyline from my office. "It was a crime, and I have the video evidence to prove it. You and Dad stood by and sanctioned battery. This isn't about an SUV. This is about accountability for 30 years of emotional terrorism, capped off by an act of physical endangerment. I could hear her start to plead, her voice rising to a high-pitched whine. Eleanor, please, we're family. Where's your loyalty? What about Thanksgiving next year? There won't be a next year, Sarah, I replied, using her first name, a clear sign the familial link was severed. And loyalty is earned, not demanded. You forfeited yours when you allowed Michael to treat me like a disposable object. I hung up before the tears, which I knew would be crocodile tears, could start. My father's call was different. It was cold rage. Eleanor, you listen to me. You call off this frivolous suit right now, or I will personally ensure you never work in this town again. You are nothing without the Vance name. James, you forget. I countered smoothly. I built my name outside of yours, and you can't threaten me professionally. I'm suing you and your company, which means I have access to every single document, every financial loophole, and every tax evasion scheme Michael has cooked up under your nose. The $8 million is only the beginning. The real damage is to the corporate structure you thought you protected. I could hear his sharp intake of breath, the fear of the corporate lion cornered. I'm playing chess, James. You were playing checkers, and now your king is exposed. The initial motions led to the first major confrontation, a closed-door settlement discussion at the law offices of Michael's counsel in downtown Chicago. The office itself was intimidating, overlooking Lake Michigan, clearly meant to project power. James, Sarah, and Michael sat across the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from smug hostility, Michael, to tight-lipped anxiety, James and Sarah. They were flanked by their lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named David Miller. I entered with Ethan, my calm exterior radiating a professional, detached intensity. I wore a charcoal suit that was all business, a direct contrast to Michael's slightly rumpled, expensive casual wear. Miller spoke first, all aggressive charm. Miss Vance, this is ridiculous. We've reviewed the footage. It's a prank, a bad joke. We admit that. We are prepared to offer a generous settlement of $50,000 for emotional distress and a full public apology. That should cover the insult and end this tiresome family dispute. I didn't even look at Miller. I addressed my father directly. $50,000? That's what you value the safety of your daughter at, James? Less than Michael's yearly SUV lease? No. My counteroffer is this. You publicly admit the 2024 Trust Amendment was executed under duress and fraudulent misrepresentation. Restore the 50/50ths ownership structure as per the 1995 document, and agree to let an independent auditor review Michael's corporate expense accounts for the last 3 years. If you don't agree, the full $8 million lawsuit goes forward, and more importantly, the corporate fraud discovery begins, which will include your personal taxes. My father paled, his composure momentarily cracking. He knew that the moment I started digging into Michael's financial maneuvers, like the creative accounting surrounding his charity foundation, a favorite tool for the wealthy in America, the entire carefully constructed Vance facade would crumble. Eleanor, you wouldn't dare drag this family's name through the mud, he hissed. You have a reputation to uphold. My reputation is built on integrity and beating the odds, I shot back, a classic American trait. Yours is about to be built on financial fraud and battery. Choose. Michael, however, was still defiant. He laughed, a genuinely cruel, nervous sound. She's bluffing, Dad. She's all talk. Who is she going to call? The IRS? The SEC? She's too scared to hurt the family name. That was my cue. I looked at Michael, the entitled golden boy who had tormented me since childhood, and let him see the absolute emptiness in my heart for him. Michael, I'm not calling the IRS. I already called the Illinois State Attorney's Office. The battery charge related to the freezer incident, which is currently a civil matter, becomes a criminal investigation the moment I confirm this settlement conference failed. You see, the $8 million lawsuit is my financial leverage, but the threat of a felony conviction is my emotional one. How do you think your fiancé, the powerful corporate lawyer, will feel about having a convicted felon for a brother-in-law? You're done, Michael. Game over. The color drained entirely from Michael's face, leaving it a sickly, ashen gray. He looked at his father, a plea for help in his eyes, but James was staring at me, realizing the terrifying depth of my planning. I hadn't just sued them. I had legally dismantled them, piece by piece. The true power was not in the money I sought, but in the access and leverage my profession and Ethan's connections gave me. The settlement conference dissolved into chaos, forcing the conflict into the most public arena, the courtroom. The time for negotiations was over. The time for reckoning had arrived. The final confrontation was not held in the closed-door confidentiality of a law office, but under the harsh fluorescent lights of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, a building that stood as a stark monument to American justice. James Vance, Michael Vance, and Sarah Vance were all present, their expressions a mix of fear and indignation. They were still clinging to the idea that this was just a spiteful move by the rejected daughter, that their wealth and reputation would ultimately shield them. They were wrong. I sat beside Ethan at the plaintiff's table, my composure unshakable. My suit was custom-made, sharp, and felt like armor. Opposite us, Michael kept shooting me dirty looks, a desperate flicker of the bully he once was. James looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, the arrogance replaced by deep, weary lines of worry. Sarah was trying to look supportive, but her eyes kept darting toward the courtroom entrance, worried about who might be watching. The entire case hinged on the concept of intent and the breach of trust, both emotional and financial. Ethan, leveraging his reputation, focused the judge on the pattern of behavior, not just the single event. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice authoritative but calm. "The claim of $8 million is not arbitrary. It is a calculation of the severe emotional distress, reckless endangerment, and battery inflicted upon my client, Miss Eleanor Vance, compounded by the clear, documented financial breach of fiduciary duty intended to completely disinherit her. The physical act of locking Miss Vance in an industrial-grade freezer, coupled with the security footage showing her father's approval, demonstrates malicious intent, a pattern that mirrors the defendant's attempts to exclude her financially from the Vance family trust, which we believe was achieved through fraudulent means." He then played the security footage. The screen in the courtroom lit up, showing the brief, horrible clip. Michael's sudden, violent shove, the slamming door, and then the damning high-five between father and son. The room went silent. The sound of James's laugh, a cruel, warm sound, echoed clearly in the courtroom. It was irrefutable. It cut through all the legal jargon and exposed the sheer, naked cruelty of their actions. When Michael's lawyer, Miller, attempted to cross-examine me, calling the incident a heat-of-the-moment prank gone wrong, I maintained my calm. "Miss Vance," Miller sneered, "isn't it true that you were only in the freezer for approximately 90 seconds? Isn't it true that you suffered no long-term physical harm?" "I was locked in an industrial-grade freezer, Mr. Miller," I replied, my voice steady. "The physical danger is documented, but the duration is irrelevant. What matters is the malicious intent shown by Michael's action and confirmed by James Vance's reaction. For 30 years, I have been systematically isolated, abused, and financially sabotaged by these two men, with the tacit approval of Sarah Vance. That 90 seconds was the symbolic culmination of a lifetime of abuse. It proved that my physical safety was considered a joke. The emotional distress comes not from the cold, but from the realization that my own father sanctioned an act that could have killed me, simply because he prefers his favorite son. That, Mr. Miller, is the definition of cruelty." I then dropped the financial bombshell. I presented the original 1995 trust document and the secretly amended 2024 document, highlighting the specific clause that was designed to transfer my voting shares to Michael upon James's retirement. I had already filed a complaint with the state bar regarding the negligence and possible collusion of the family's longtime trust attorney, forcing him to retract his deposition. The legal complexity was overwhelming the Vance defense. James Vance's face, which had been pale, now looked flushed with despair. He had finally grasped that I wasn't interested in a mere payout. I was interested in justice. And justice meant the dismantling of the power structure that had allowed them to abuse me. The pressure built over the next few days. The local Chicago news stations, drawn by the $8 million claim and the dramatic freezer footage, were camped outside the courthouse. The Vance family name, which had always represented impeccable corporate values and philanthropy, was now synonymous with domestic cruelty and potential corporate fraud. Vance Holdings stock, already shaky from Michael's poor management, began to plummet. The climax arrived not in a final verdict, but in a sudden, desperate retreat. On the third day of the hearing, during a recess, James Vance, looking utterly defeated, walked over to me, leaving his lawyer behind. He was a shell of the booming, confident patriarch. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "please, this is enough. You're destroying us. The board is calling for my resignation. The banks are reviewing our lines of credit. Michael is talking about fleeing the country. It was a stupid joke. I admit it was cruel. I was wrong. Please, stop this." He wasn't arguing anymore. He was begging. He looked at me, expecting to see the wounded little girl, but he saw the polished, unyielding lawyer. "You called it a prank, James," I reminded him, my eyes devoid of emotion. "A prank is spilling milk. This was battery, and the financial fraud was premeditated theft. I gave you a chance at the settlement conference to avoid this public humiliation, but you scoffed. Now, you will face the consequences." He slumped, the fight gone out of him. "What do you want?" "I want exactly what I asked for," I stated, pulling out a pre-drafted, revised settlement agreement. This time, I wasn't asking for money from them, I was forcing them to concede everything. 1. You publicly and legally invalidate the 2024 Trust Amendment and restore the 1,995 and 50/50ths division of non-voting shares. 2. James Vance resigns immediately as CEO of Vance Holdings. The company will be placed under a court-appointed administrator for 6 months to clean up Michael's mess. 3. Michael Vance is permanently banned from holding any executive or fiduciary role within any Vance entity and must sell his existing 5% stock back to the holding company at par value. 4. You pay the full $8 million claim for emotional distress and battery, not to me, but to a newly established foundation dedicated to supporting women escaping domestic and familial financial abuse. The paperwork must reflect that the payment is an admission of fault in the battery claim. He stared at the figure. $8 million to a charity? Why? "Because the money was never the point, James," I said, finally allowing a small, cold smile. "The power was. I don't need your blood money. I need your public confession of guilt and your total loss of control. Sign this, and the lawsuits cease. Refuse, and the full weight of the SEC and the Illinois State Attorney's Office, along with the corporate fraud claims, drops tomorrow. You choose." He looked at the paper, then at Michael, who was openly weeping in the gallery, and finally at Sarah, whose face was a mask of shock and betrayal. He picked up the pen and with a shaking hand signed the document that dismantled his legacy. It was delicious watching Michael implode. His idea of fleeing the country quickly devolved into trying to sell his custom, barely used BMW SUV on Facebook Marketplace for cash, only to realize nobody would meet the asking price from a disgraced Vance. His desperate, misspelled Instagram story posts about lightly loved corporate assets became the biggest joke on the Chicago social circuit. Ethan's associate even sent me a screenshot of Michael trying to trade his vintage Rolex for crypto. The irony was so thick you could carve it with a butter knife. The golden boy was finally learning what actual labor felt like, and it looked exhausting. And then there was Sarah, My mother's response to losing her social standing wasn't introspection, it was a furious attempt to spin the narrative at the next charity luncheon. I heard via Linda that Sarah had tried to cast herself as the victim, lamenting that the stress of Eleanor's excessive studying had driven James to temporary insanity, and that I was always a bit too intense about those legal books. The best part? When she was immediately ghosted by her former best friend, who quietly informed Sarah that she, too, had a highly successful corporate attorney daughter who fully supported my actions. American society loves a winner, and right then, I was the one holding the trophy. The consequences were swift and devastating. James Vance resigned immediately, citing health reasons. Michael Vance, facing legal repercussions and public shame, effectively became unemployable and was forced to sell the stock he had always taken for granted. Sarah, who had never challenged her husband or son, found herself completely isolated, the society friends who once admired the Vance wealth now shunning the family. The power had shifted entirely. My own path had been cleared. With the successful and highly publicized lawsuit, I didn't just get justice. I gained immense legal credibility and a reputation as a merciless, yet ethical, powerhouse who stands up for herself. I took my shot and rebuilt my life, not from the ashes, but from the very foundation they tried to crush. I leveraged the settlement money into my own corporate integrity consulting firm, Eleanor Vance and Associates, specializing in preventing internal corporate fraud and family business disputes. I opened my primary office in a gleaming skyscraper in San Francisco, right in the heart of the corporate world, a far cry from the stifling atmosphere of Chicago. My career, once something my father dismissed as a hobby, became my triumphant identity. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the neglected daughter of James Vance. I was Eleanor Vance, the successful CEO who brought down a corrupt system. 6 months after the settlement, I was sitting on the terrace of a seaside villa we rented in Big Sur, California, watching the Pacific sunset. I had finally married Ethan, who had been my rock and my most powerful ally. He was leaning against the railing, holding a glass of champagne. "You know, they tried to contact me last week," I admitted, looking at the vibrant orange horizon. "They want to know if they can attend the annual Thanksgiving gala I'm hosting for the foundation." Ethan turned, his smile warm and genuine. "And what did you say, counselor?" I raised my glass in a toast to the setting sun, a symbol of the end of one life and the brilliant start of another. I told them to enjoy the view from the outside, that the American dream is about earning your place, not inheriting it, and they forfeited their right to be at my table a long time ago. Now I have a different kind of family. We clinked glasses, the sound sharp and final. I had driven my own car down Route 1, the vast open road ahead of me reflecting the limitless future I now controlled. The cold dark of that freezer was a memory, a necessary crucible that had hardened my resolve. I had earned the last laugh, and it was absolutely priceless.